I am not going to lose Vietnam. I am not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the same way as China. Newly inaugurated President Lyndon B. Johnson said this at a White House meeting on November 24th, 1963. The politics and the politicians surrounding the Vietnam War all had secret agendas, and their secret agendas were based on one fear that they all shared, and that one fear is communism. The book that we'll be discussing today is a 2019 Excellence in Nonfiction for Young Adults winner and is highly praised by the New York Times and Publisher Weekly. It is called Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam. War affects us all in different ways. The Vietnam War is something that divided the country back then and is still very controversial today. The book is written to tell the stories of 8 people and how the war directly affected them. They're heartfelt stories from 6 American soldiers, 1 American military nurse, and 1 Vietnamese refugee, all touch a nerve as we are described in detail what they had to face in country and when they returned back home. The book is separated by words from prominent figures during the wartime, such as President Lyndon B. Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr., President Richard Nixon, and President Gerald Ford. There's also some other people mentioned throughout that also play a vital role in how the story unfolds, but you'll be able to see who they are when you read the book. The excerpt that I'll be reading today is actually from one of the American soldiers. He's an American infantry soldier. His name is Jan Scruggs. This is actually a picture of him, his second day in Vietnam. Something I want to mention about this book is that there are pictures throughout about different things that you read so that you'll be able to get a visual representation of what they're talking about, which is actually really interesting and cool in my opinion. The excerpt that I'll be reading is when Jan Scruggs was in country from April 1969 to April 1970. Scruggs found about 90% of his company had been drafted and didn't want to be in Vietnam. They weren't worried about stopping communism. They just wanted to survive their year in Vietnam. News from home about the continuous anti-war protests didn't help company morale. A fog of depression had settled over everyone. It was nearly impossible to fight for something you didn't believe in and for a country that didn't believe in you. Sometimes Scruggs would go along on one of the helicopter rides to a nearby village to provide sanitation measures and simple medical care. One day, Scruggs flew with a medic to get polio vaccines out to a friendly village. The village, like many in Vietnam, had high rates of polio, a disease that caused muscle weakness and even paralysis. The vaccine was explained to the village chief and his wife. After careful consideration, the chief decided everyone should be vaccinated. One by one, adults and children stepped forward for vaccination. The Americans left feeling good about what they had done. A few days later, word reached them about what the Viet Cong had done after they left. The Viet Cong brought the village chief and his wife into the middle of the village, said Scruggs, and blew them up to retaliate for accepting the vaccine. It was a typical Viet Cong action, making it dangerous for villagers to have anything to do with Americans, even accepting life-saving medical care. No matter who the villagers sided with, they risked terrible reprisals from the other side. It sickened Scruggs that the one life-saving thing he had done had turned into a disaster. I am personally finding out so much information surrounding the Vietnam War, regarding the politics and what they had to face when they were in the war zone. And while this book is far from uplifting, I do feel as though I'm honoring those who lost their lives and the ones who returned home but were never welcomed home. The country viewed them as the war, and our soldiers and our military are far from the war. They just went to where they were told. So I think by reading these words from the people who experienced Vietnam firsthand, I hope in some way that I'm honoring those who didn't return and those who did and did not receive a welcome. Just a warning, I cried heavily at the end of the book. It will truly touch your heart, and it is so worth reading. With a war going on at home, how can the soldiers and the nurses face the task at hand? How can they do what they're supposed to do knowing what's going on back at home? Can these 8 survive Vietnam? And if they do, will they ever be the same? Go find a copy of Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam Today, and find out. You will not be disappointed.